Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another event hosted by the Warsaw Institute. And today we'll speak about the key takeaways of G7 summit in Italian Apulia. I'm pleased to welcome my today's guests, Kacper Kita, expert of Nowy Ład, Warsaw Institute, and author of books. Welcome.
Hello, thanks for having me.
And Lukas Steinman, experienced journalist, war reporter, and author of many publications as well. Welcome, Luca.
Good evening, welcome.
Thank you, gentlemen, for joining today. Before we start, I will just mention that our event is organized thanks to support of National Institute of Freedom, Center for the Development of Civil Society. So, coming back to the topic, G7 summit, Italian presidency, many important topics touched during this gathering of biggest world leaders. They discussed Africa, discussed climate change, development, Middle East situation, Ukraine situation. So many key topics discussed during the summit that took place a week ago. But we'll start with pretty general question. So as we know, Italy holds a rotating presidency in G7 now, with first female Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, leader of Fratelli d'Italia, party that surged in previous Europarliamentary elections from 10 to 24 seats. So I want to ask you first, how would you evaluate the Italian presidency so far for G7? And additionally, how do you see Italy's position on geopolitical map, Italy's foreign position among other countries? Kacper Kita.
Yes, it's interesting. You've mentioned that the European Parliament election coincided with the G7 summit, and it's obvious that Prime Minister Meloni has been trying to build up her personal position and the position of Italian government by using both of these events. I would point to the fact that Meloni has been now governing Italy for over a year and a half, and she's now been in power for longer than any of the previous four governments. Well, the Draghi government, who dismissed after less than a year and a half, of two Conte governments, one with the left, one with Salvini's Lega, previously the Gentiloni government, they all managed to be in power for just about a year and a half, and now Meloni has surpassed this mark, and at the same time she received a new democratic mandate, a new level of support, even a bit higher than the one she received back in September 2022 from Italian voters. And this is, I would say, this positive part for her, and also the fact that she's been very active on the international stage is also, I think, one way of legitimizing herself, despite her party's historical heritage, legitimizing herself as a strong leader, as a internationally recognized leader. And on the other hand, well, obviously she didn't achieve her goals in the European Parliament elections because the slogan of her party was Italy changes Europe, and well, Italy didn't change Europe because voters in other countries didn't vote the way that Meloni would like them to vote, and there's no new right-wing or centre-right majority in the European Parliament that she would like to lead. So I think that the glass is at the same time half full for her, in terms that she still has domestic support, but also I think half empty because she didn't achieve her goals in the European Union policy, and she doesn't have that strong of a position as she would like to have, for example, in terms of now the negotiations around European Union, the European Commission, and other EU institutions. But she thought that she would have a stronger hand to play. And regarding the G7 summit, obviously this is also something that's important for for Meloni, and I think that she certainly wanted to focus on Africa because this is something that she has been presenting as her priority, and the fact that she also invited some African leaders, that there has been a separate statement on the cooperation with Africa in terms of energy, and she has said on multiple occasions that she wants Africa to become more stable, more politically stable, more economically stable, and basically become a stable neighborhood for Europe, and also a provider of energy for Europe in a larger extent. And at the same time, she has obviously been advocating Africa stabilizing so that there would be a smaller influx of migrants across the Mediterranean, which is something also problematic for Italy. So on one hand, I think that she has been pushing her agenda in EU and in G7, but I don't see that many, I would say, tangible results for the time being. She's been pushing the agenda. She's been pushing the debate in many countries, perhaps in the way that she would like to. But she has been raising points that are important for her. But I don't see that many tangible results, whether regarding EU, whether regarding Africa, whether regarding migration. Obviously, none of these areas it's easy to deliver that much in a year and a half. But and Meloni has this mandate for 3.5 more years, and perhaps even more. And we want to get into the details of Italian politics because she was also pushing to make herself more, to give herself more power with the proposed premierato reform. But certainly, I think that this G7 strengthens her, but there's not that much meat, I would say, that she's been able to deliver for the time being.
Thank you very much. So still, as you've mentioned, the glass is half full, half empty for the Prime Minister, but she still has a strong mandate among Italians to rule. Now I will give the floor to Luca Steinman with the same question of what's your opinion of Italian presidency in G7 so far and Italian position on geopolitical map of the world.
Well, thank you. I've been following the G7 very, very closely, actually, because I'm in Italy now, and despite my name and my appearance, I'm Italian, and I've been following also Giorgia Meloni pretty closely in the last weeks. I perfectly agree with Kaspar when he's saying that her final goal is basically to change somehow Europe, but we have to understand in which way she would like to do it and in which way she is trying, let's say, to use the chance of the G7 for her to change Europe according to her views. Basically, she's representing in Italy an experiment. This means a coalition between those powers that were called far right or that are called far right. Her own political party, Fratelli d'Italia, has a direct connection with the past fascist regime here in Italy, and her ally of the Lega is also a party that would be considered part of the far right. But at the same time, these two parties are allied with the Fratelli d'Italia party, which is a member of the Popular Party on the European level. So Italy is, we can say, the only European country, Western European countries, where the so-called far right found an alliance with the Popular Party and is creating a stable majority. And this kind of question is arising also in other countries. We're seeing it these days in France, especially with the Républicains, so the Gaullists, splitting themselves on the question if it's needed to make an alliance with Marine Le Pen or not. So basically, Giorgia Meloni is trying to push through Europe this model saying it is possible to create coalitions between the far right and the conservatives or the middle right, and this is not going to change the geopolitical position of the countries in which this is taking place, like Italy, in any ways. And this is also something Marine Le Pen is looking for. She's trying also to reposition herself in a kind of pro-Western stance rather than pro-Russian, in order to give the guarantees, saying, I might be considered as far right, but I'm not challenging the pro-Western France positioning within the European Union and within the NATO. And that's why we are seeing in these hours how Giorgia Meloni is incredibly pushing out Orban Fidesz, so the Hungarian government representatives, from the ECR political party in the European Union. So to conclude this first statement, trying to make it very clear and very simple, the goal of Giorgia Meloni in this moment is to show that that far-right parties can have alliances with the popular parties, and that the main challenge, the main fighting platform is not anymore between far-right and the rest of the world, but it is between pro-Western and anti-Western, thus meaning today pro-Russia, but in the future probably also pro-China. And Meloni is giving these guarantees internationally, saying, look, I can host I can host the G7. I can be the president. I'm here. I give you all the guarantees of Italy belonging to NATO, of Italy supporting Ukraine. In Italy, there is a motto right now saying that Meloni is more American than the Americans right now, like quoting a sentence in the past saying that some priests are more Catholic than the Pope. It's a popular way of saying here in Italy, which I say it's kind of appropriate, you know. So as long as Meloni belongs to this geopolitical part of the world, she can have the guarantees internationally that she can have, let's say, free space in moving inside Italy when it comes to domestic policies, the already mentioned premierato, also some cultural policies, some media policies, and so on. And I'm sure that she might get the support of some other right-wing political parties in Europe that are looking forward to have for the first time the possibility to go to the power, and she's already in a power position.
Thank you very much. Indeed, interesting politics model conducted by Giorgia Meloni is worth observing for the upcoming months and probably years. Now let's move to more specific topic. Here I'd like to relate to war between Ukraine and Russia. That was a hot topic during the G7 discussions. We'll stay with you, Luca, for this question. So before the G7 summit, President Zelensky announced many expectations from G7 leaders, like fighter jet coalition, bolstered air defense, long-range capabilities, and many, many more. But during the summit, and now we have the aftermath of the summit, the leaders decided on a loan worth $50 billion to Kiev, coming from frozen Russian assets. How does that align with previous expectations of Ukrainian president, and how big of a support from the G7 leaders is that to Ukraine? Luca, please.
It seems that the timing was very bad for Zelensky, I would say, because these European elections were a moment in which people were also voting were also expressing their support with the policies of the Western countries, of the European countries towards Ukraine, and towards the support of Ukraine also in terms of weapons. And we have already been seeing since a long time, since many months at least, that many European populations are getting more tired than before in supporting Ukraine compared to the first months of war. And now the G7 was able to confirm, obviously, its support to Ukraine by supporting financially the country through the Russian frozen assets. However, the big question, the main question related to the long-term support of the European countries to Ukraine stays. I don't think it's a case that Vladimir Putin decided not to open any possibilities of negotiations right now, because and that's why the at the end of the day, the last summit, the last peace summit for Ukraine in Switzerland was an unsuccess, we can say brutally, because definitely there was no one to negotiate with. So it was basically a meeting within friends or within allies, but it was not a negotiation platform. And Russia is sending this way a very clear message. We might be ready to negotiate only under our conditions. Russia already lost what it had to lose, in terms of international connections with the West on the 24th of February 2022. And now Russians are saying we are going to keep on fighting in Ukraine since we have nothing to lose anymore when it comes to our relations to the West. So Ukraine is living, I would say, difficult political moment right now, because the goal of Russia is really the one of making the European countries tired, making the West tired of their support, of its support to Ukraine. When it comes to weapons, when it comes to financial support, and when it comes, for instance, to the support in some countries of the local Ukrainian refugees. And that's why also Russia is trying to find in these moments a cooperation with all other international powers like China, like Iran, that have an interest in fighting diplomatically the West in this moment. And that's this is a reason why we're seeing Russia being so supportive de facto to Hamas in this moment when it comes to the war in the Middle East. So I'm not very optimistic when it comes to this, and I think Russia, at least the strategy of Russia, will be the one of trying to push as much as possible in Ukraine until they will get something diplomatically. They're not getting any relevant success on the ground, but if you see at the narrative of the Russian propaganda right now, they're keeping on remembering or giving their view that Kyiv is a Russian city, that Odessa is a Russian city. So they want to go there. They're saying, stay at our condition. If you don't accept our condition, we'll not negotiate and we'll try to arrive there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This is definitely not an easy period for the Ukraine, especially that Russia is speeding up the activities on the front line. In the meantime, I highly encourage our viewers to ask questions in the chat. And now I will give the floor to Kacper Kita. $50 billion loan to Kiev. But on the other hand, Russia speeding up the military activities and getting more support from other powers. What's your view on that?
Well, obviously, it's better than nothing. But I would totally agree with what Lucas said, that it's not a good time for Ukraine, and that the summit in Switzerland has not been a success for Ukraine. Obviously, we do not see the signs that the Russians would be eager to negotiate with the Ukrainians. And we also see serious disagreements between the Western countries. We see that, for example, the discussion around whether Ukraine should be able to use Western weapons to attack goals in Russia. It's ongoing, and we see very divergent views here between given European countries. We also see divergent views in terms of public support for sending more military help for Ukraine. I think that Russia is basically fighting a war of attrition. It wants. It hopes that with time it will be able to convince Western decision makers that they should negotiate over the heads of Ukraine and negotiate on their own terms. Obviously, Russia is also watching the presidential campaign in the US and the fact that we may see more political instability and conflict inside the most powerful Western country. And obviously, it will be very interesting whether Putin would be willing to negotiate a deal with a President Trump or with a re-elected President Biden, whether this would influence his decisions, because I don't think that he would be willing to negotiate anything before the U.S. election. And we also see that on one hand, nobody wants to be seen as the one country that is stopping help for Ukraine, but on the other hand, there's much less enthusiasm for actually giving more to Ukraine, and less, I would say, hope that this may actually make Ukraine regain all of its territories. And for the time being, Ukraine has been stating that its goal is to regain all territories, that it does not want to lose any of them. And obviously, this is getting difficult to achieve, especially with the fact that the Americans do not want the Ukrainians to use American weapons to attack goals in Russia. And obviously, this is also something that's I think only from of the major powers, only Great Britain is fully on board with Ukraine using its equipment in such a uh, drastic way. And in France, the French are more open to that. The Italians are skeptical. The Germans are skeptical. The Americans are skeptical, and obviously Russia believes that as time goes by, it will get to a point where, for example, a new American president or, for example, a German chancellor fighting for his own survival would want to negotiate a deal, for example, because it's also something that's been that we have to take into account. That, for example, Olaf Scholz may want to push for a deal with Russia for some at least part-time cessation of the war, because of the fact that he's fighting for his own political survival in Germany.
You've mentioned America's involvement. You've mentioned U.S. elections. So let's stay with that topic. United States of America, one of the symbols of NATO alliance, and of course Ukraine is still not receiving the invitation to NATO. But on the other hand, American Secretary of State Antony Blinken is using a phrase of a bridge to membership, which is an initiative that involves package with long-term military support for Ukraine. How feasible is potential NATO membership for Ukraine, and can we expect this membership not in 10 years, but in the closer future, in few years time from now? We'll stay with Kacper.
Well, I would say again to be well realistic, that it's not that probable that Ukraine will become a NATO member in the near future, in the next few years, because of, well, Biden has stated the obvious, that before Ukraine would become a NATO member, Ukraine would have to regain will have to regain its territory, would have to end the war with Russia, and obviously Russia will do everything in its capabilities to stop Ukraine becoming a NATO member, and it would not want to accept Ukraine regaining its territory, Ukraine being able to become a normal NATO country. And also we see that many political forces and many governments also, I think, may be actually in Europe may be skeptical of NATO membership for Ukraine. And we have to remember that all NATO countries have to agree for for a new member to be admitted to NATO. And when it comes to the terms, you've used this the term Secretary Blinken used. It's also a subject of controversy, of serious controversy. You see, for example, that the Secretary General Stoltenberg, who's now nearing the end of his twice extended term as the chief of NATO, as the leader of NATO, he also said that that this wording should be stronger at the NATO summit in Washington that we are approaching, that will be held in July, and this will be the 75th anniversary of the founding of NATO. This will be held in America. This will be held a few months before the American election. This was to be a success for the Biden administration, but for the time being, we see that there's serious disagreement. That Stoltenberg says, for example, that the wording should be stronger. Some Eastern European leaders also suggest that, for example, Ukraine should have not only a bridge, but, for example, an irreversible path to NATO membership. Because the simple statement that Ukraine will become a NATO member someday in the future. This is something that was given to Ukraine back in 2008 in Bucharest. It didn't change much. And I think that for the time being, we see that the American government is, I believe, following the mood of the American population, and they are also quite skeptical of escalating the conflict. We see this also in terms of attitude towards giving more weapons to Ukraine and especially using the way these weapons are used. So I think that the path for Ukraine to becoming a NATO member is quite a rocky one in the next few years.
Thank you. So still a long path to go through for Ukraine in terms of NATO membership. Now I will give the floor to Luca with the same question of feasible Ukrainian membership in NATO and bridge to membership mentioned by State Secretary Antony Blinken.
I think the bridge membership might be, I would say, as for now, the only solution for a potential official cooperation between Ukraine and NATO. Because as for now, we've been seeing, let's say, the general West supporting Ukraine. We have been seeing some countries of the West having a stronger support, starting from the US, from Great Britain, and from Poland. But we have not seen of course, NATO being involved in it. And I don't see how an official membership of Ukraine inside NATO could be possible within, let's say, the next years, or let's say throughout the time being, simply because of the fact that Ukraine is not the government of Ukraine is not controlling its entire territories, and only this is not giving the conditions necessary to being part of NATO. As a second fact, I have doubts about the real will of several Western countries, including Ukraine, into the NATO. We are seeing that not all the Western countries broke at least their commercial relations with Russia, and still there are forces pushing for a coexistence, a peaceful coexistence with Russia within the next years, and this is going to be more difficult with Ukraine being member of NATO. I think the most feasible solution, or the most possible solution, would be a cooperation between NATO and Ukraine, not going through official channels, but going through the NATO member states that have a direct presence in Ukraine, by supporting the Ukrainian army, by providing instructors training the Ukrainian soldiers, and by providing intelligence, technologies, and weapons to the Ukrainian army. I think this is, if it has to be, this is the only solution for a cooperation, an indirect cooperation between NATO and Ukraine within the next years at least.
Thank you. So for the time being, unofficial cooperation would be the most suitable in current situation. Gentlemen, we spoke about Russia. Let's speak about other huge power on geopolitical map. I'm referring to China. During G7 summit, the leaders underlined Chinese support for Russian, especially defense industry, even accusing China on too big support towards the conflict in the East. On the other hand, the leaders also mentioned the potential use of sanctions against Chinese companies supporting Russia. It came up with a quick response from China that mentioned that the Western leaders are trying to malign Chinese influence and hinder Chinese companies with such threats. So I'd like to ask you, how do you interpret those tensions that are appearing between the so-called West and Western powers and China, one of the biggest powers in the world? Luca, please, the floor is yours.
To answer your questions, we have to quote the meeting that took place around 1 month ago between Putin and Xi Jinping. If we read the document that they signed, there is a comparison between the situation in Donbass, in Ukraine, and the situation of Taiwan. What can we read through this document? Basically, China and Russia have a common interest right now. So the one of limiting the influence of the West and of the United States in the world, to push for a multipolar world where rising powers, like they consider themselves to be, can have more space and more power. And this document is saying something, again, very interesting. It's de facto saying that both Taiwan and Donbass or Ukraine were part historically of China on the one side and Russia on the other side, and that these countries has been lost by the motherland. I'm quoting kind of their words, like to explain, during the 20th century under the hegemony of the United States. Now the globalization controlled by the United States is going to an end, so these two countries have the right, kind of, to get back the control to these areas that they lost during the last century. And this is showing precisely the interest of China in supporting Russia in this moment. And this is showing precisely why China is also sending weapons to Russia to be used in Ukraine, generally and many times doing it again and indirectly through North Korea in this case. So giving, let's say, North Korea the green light to send these weapons to Russia that are used in Ukraine. So I would say this is the main ground that is pushing China to support Russia in this war and to have Russia as an ally also when it comes to other strategic countries of the world. I'm mentioning two of them. First of all, Africa, of course, where China and Russia are trying to deepen their presence. Both economically and when it comes to Russia as well, military through the Wagner Group, which has been deployed in the sub-Saharan countries, especially in the sub-Saharan countries, but as well in the Middle East, where this is something that we're not talking so much about, but several Chinese companies are going to countries in the Middle East where Russia has an influence, operating there where Russia has an influence. And I would call this momentum that China and Russia are having, let's say, a marriage of interest, a wedding of interest, because they have very different agenda when it comes to other topics. When it comes, for instance, to the influence in the Far East, in the South Chinese Sea, for instance. Basically, we can say that in this area, as a paradox, Russia is more close to the American position than to the Chinese position. But in this moment, when they both see the interest, the shared interest in facing the American presence, the American influence, they are underlining the topics that they both share. I would be very surprised if this alliance, this entente cordiale, could last a long time. Like I would say more it's an alliance, and when it comes to alliance, like Sun Tzu is teaching, like in politics, no one is a friend forever.
Thank you. So definitely a temporary alliance here. Kacper, can you share your thoughts and insights on this situation between China and the G7 leaders, especially in the context of potential more sanctions against Chinese companies? Kacper, I guess you are muted.
Sorry. Certainly, we see that there's a lot of American pressure on European countries to become more confrontational vis-à-vis China, and this is also interesting to observe. For example, going back to the beginning of our discussion, when we see Italy, who under one of the previous governments, the Conte government, became part of Chinese New Beltway initiative, and under Meloni government, Italy went away from this initiative, and this didn't come as a surprise, because Meloni herself for many years has been quite vocally confrontational towards the People's Republic of China. Back when she was youth minister in Berlusconi's government, she was quite famous to support some Italian athletes who didn't want to participate in the opening of the Beijing Olympic Games. And Fratelli d'Italia would for example host some meetings on human rights in China with some Hong Kong activists in Italian parliament back when they were in the opposition. And now we see that also being anti-Chinese is a way for Meloni to legitimize herself, despite, again, her historical background vis-à-vis the Americans, and also on the larger Western scene. And on the other hand, we see that we have other countries in the EU, in the West, who are not that confrontational. For example, France, which under President Macron has been trying to push through the so-called strategic autonomy of Europe, with Macron going both to America and to China, with now Xi Jinping visiting France in his first visit to Europe after 5 years, back in May, a few weeks ago. And we see that there's a lot of I would say also tension and different viewpoints because of in Europe and also in the United States, because of central question of what Luca has mentioned, whether the alliance between China and Russia is a stable one. And for the time being, it looks that they have common goals in the foreseeable future. But obviously, as you've said, nothing is set in stone forever. And there are certainly some in America who would want to make Russia less tied to China. And on the other hand, there are those in Europe, I think, who either would want to go back to having good relationship with Russia, or, for example, would think that, well, Russia has been behaving itself as a non-reliable partner, but perhaps China is more reasonable. It's certainly that way in the thinking of many in France and in Germany, who think that, well, for the time being, Putin has not Putin didn't want a stable Europe. Putin didn't want to make a deal with us back at the beginning of 2022. He didn't want to negotiate a peace deal in Ukraine. He lied to us, etc. But perhaps China is more reasonable. The central theme of Xi Jinping's visit in Paris has been pushing China to make Russia behave more rationally. That means make Russia negotiate with the West and an end to the war in Ukraine. And this is something that's been the central point of, for example, Macron's agenda vis-a-vis the Chinese. This is also deeply rooted in history, because this is similar to what General de Gaulle would, as president, would do, with him back then developing ties with the communist China, with Mao Zedong, so that to balance the Soviet Union and to play up this relationship between Beijing and Moscow back then. And he wanted China to become more independent of Russia. As now, I think that many in the West would want also this alliance between China and Russia to become less stable, and to try to convince, for example, the Chinese to push Russians to make a deal with the West. But we will see whether anything of the sort will actually happen, because again, there's been a lot of talk, there's been a lot of nice statements and handshakes, but for the time being, China is still supporting Russia militarily, and Russia is still conducting its war.
Thank you for giving the French example. That shows that even among Europe we have pretty different views on cooperation with China. We have Italian view, French view, Hungarian view, and many more. Gentlemen, with the question of China, we've came to the end of our interesting debate today. So I want to thank you very much for the participation and for sharing your expertise with our viewers. And I also want to thank our viewers for participating today and listening to your interesting responses. So once again, thank you very much. And I highly encourage everyone to follow our next events, reports, articles, and other publications. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.